We are powered by Research Luxembourg.
Hello and welcome to SciLux, the podcast where we talk about scientific developments and technological changes in Luxembourg. And in today's show, we're launching the next season with a very, very special guest and a very special cooperation and many other special things. I hope you will enjoy it. But first of all, let me tell you a little bit more about the guest. So our today's guest is Dr. Kathryn Hadler, the director of ESRIC, the European Space Resources Innovation Centre. Kathryn did her PhD in chemical engineering, and before joining ESRIC, she was a lecturer at Imperial College London. She specializes in mineral processing and recovery, and today we're going to talk a lot about space resources, at least I hope so. Thank you very much, Kathryn, for coming today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, so as I already gave this teaser to our listeners, I have to start straight with that. Can you tell us what space resources are and why are we talking about them in Luxembourg? I recently actually had a chat with someone who is totally new to space research, and they were like, space resources in Luxembourg? No.
You know, it's really funny though, because the first time when I first got into this subject about 5-6 years ago, everybody talked about Luxembourg and space resources. Really? And then you find out more and you realise what a central role Luxembourg is playing on the global stage. But space resources themselves, I think when we talk about space resources, we think about space mining. And what most people tend to think about is this concept of going to an asteroid, harnessing platinum from an asteroid and bringing that back to Earth. And that's one way of thinking about space resources. But the other approach of thinking about space resources is using the resources that we find there to enable us to spend longer in space, enable us to do more science and to travel onwards into space. And that's the part that we are particularly interested in the near future and at ESRIC.
And that's where the first abbreviation comes into play as well. Is that ISRU? That's how you say it, or ISRU? I never know with the abbreviations.
You can either way works. People use ISRU, ISRU, and yeah, this in situ resource utilization. So one of the big problems we have with space exploration at the moment is you have to take everything with you. And the mass cost of leaving the Earth's atmosphere is huge. So if you can produce usable resources on the surface of the moon, for example, so rocket propellant or oxygen, water, things that we can use to support human life, then it allows us to spend longer, to travel further. It unlocks the potential of space.
I always think about this taking to space, you know, all the different objects that sometimes astronauts have with them. I don't know, guitars and it's really like I read some article that it really costs a lot to bring like really 1 kilogram of something additional, right? So of course we will not have a guitar that we're going to produce on the moon. We're talking about more useful things as you mentioned. So the propellants and all that, but who knows? I mean, we're supposed to enjoy our lives there as well.
Absolutely. I actually think that's a great idea. But this is one of the great things about the subject is everything is a resource, and we need to think quite creatively about the things that we can produce from the things that we find. So, you know, you might find that space guitar one day.
Okay, but first we need to focus on the things that we know that we can produce and that we really need to survive as well, right? So I know that you prepared some very interesting pub quiz question for our listeners that is a little bit related to that. So can you please ask the question? And as usual, listeners, remember that the answer to this question will be only at the very end of the podcast.
So the question is, if we have 2 astronauts on the surface of the moon for a year, in order to produce enough oxygen for them to survive, how much lunar soil do I need to dig up?
Listen until the end so that you know exactly what are the estimates, right? Because we're still talking about estimates. It can always change. I know that recently you also published an article where you kind of discussed that we actually need more lunar soil than we would assume for oxygen, right? So this we will discuss in a second. But first of all, I'm very happy you said lunar soil, because we did not introduce another very important term that when we talk about space resources, which is regolith. So regolith, we can say lunar soil. Is that the same or not exactly? Or is it kind of using a simplified term for that?
Yeah, again, we can use them interchangeably, and we tend to use lunar soil to to describe the dry, dusty material that cover the surface of the moon. The technical term is regolith, but soil, regolith, we're talking about the same thing.
Okay, good. So this is also a crucial thing. And then, as you mentioned, it's very difficult to talk about it all in very, limited terms, because we're talking about moon, we're talking about Mars, maybe asteroids and whatever. So let's just kind of try to make it, step by step. We start with the moon, space resources and moon. What are we interested in right now? What are we trying to get from the moon? What are we planning to get from the moon? What do we need? Basics.
Okay, so the first thing that we need is we need to be able to support human life. And for that, we need water or oxygen. We also can use oxygen, water for rocket propellant. So there's two things from one resource. And both of those are a really good place to start. And actually, this goes back to my pub quiz question. There is plenty of oxygen on the surface of the moon. But the problem is that it's bound in the minerals. So that dust that coats the surface of the moon, the lunar soil, the regolith, the oxygen is in those minerals. And so to extract oxygen, we need to chemically separate the oxygen from the minerals. So that's one potential resource. There's lots of different ways we can do this, and there's lots of different ways that have been suggested in the literature, but fundamentally it's about getting the oxygen from those minerals. The other resource that the Americans and NASA are very, very interested in, very excited by, is water ice. And there's water ice potentially in the bottom of craters, so at the lunar South Pole, so permanently shadowed regions. And there's been studies that have shown that there is water ice, how much there is, how it's mixed in with the regolith, all of these things we don't know yet. But when NASA send their missions to the moon eventually, when the Artemis program...
Exactly. Actually, today when we're talking, there is going to be another trial as far as I know. I think it was 27th and we're talking on the 27th. Right?
I think they've had to roll back because of the hurricane that was coming in. So now the next launch window, I think it's gone back now into October, November because of the storm I was reading yesterday. But that's exactly where the Artemis program eventually will go, is towards the lunar South Pole to investigate more the potential for water.
But you mentioned also that this is the part that is permanently shadowed, and that's also tricky, isn't it? For the missions.
It's incredibly challenging. And what I love is all the different ways that people have put forward to extract the water ice that we know that there is evidence for, but we don't know how much. So all of these things, and then they put forward some fantastic ideas for ways of getting the water ice out of the very, very cold, permanently shadowed regions. Things like putting a tent over it and heating up the regolith so the water then sublimes and we can collect it. There's ways of having rovers go down and collect all sorts of different processes. But all of this is based on limited data. And so the first thing we need to do is go and find out more about the resources that are there. But the other important thing to note here is it's not just about producing oxygen, producing water. It's all the infrastructure that goes along. So things like landing pads and roads and power and all of these kind of things as well, that also needs to be put into place.
I have this feeling that, when you're planning these missions, there is always this trap that oh God, we forgot about this part that we need. We don't have, landing pads. What do we do now? I mean, there are just so many different things you have to think of and so many different startups that come into play and so many different ideas you need to employ as well, right? Because again, we're talking about where do we land? What are we looking for? How do we get the energy? And so on and so forth. I mean, and we're supposed to be doing it pretty soon.
Yeah, when you start thinking about it and start looking at this, starting something entirely from the beginning in a place that is hostile, we can't really send people up to fix things when they break. We need to have automation, you need to have reliability, we need to have all of the infrastructure we've talked about, the power and so on. You see the scale of the challenge, and I think this is one of the big draws for people, is it's just such an enormously complex and ambitious concept that it is absolutely fascinating. And one of the things we often talk about in research is finding gaps. What's the gap in the current knowledge? the whole thing is a gap because it doesn't exist yet. So actually it's more gaps than it is knowledge. And this is one of the things about it that I absolutely love.
I mean, you've been researching before earth mining, right? So I guess the gaps were smaller there, or were there still some kind of fields where you were completely going into the uncertainty that we talk about when we talk about the space resources?
That's a really good question. The gaps are smaller, but actually there's still a lot of unknowns. And I think with the mining industry, the challenges are that you're dealing with complex natural resources. So although we have processes, for example, to extract copper on Earth, it's been going on for many thousands of years, and certainly in the way that we do it now for over 100 years, we have all these processes that work and that are relatively well known. But even then, each ore body is slightly different. There's still a lot we don't understand, and we can't predict very well about all of the different steps in the process. And so there's still a lot of challenges, and that's in a really well-established process. So again, you'd see with something that we're basing on a lot of assumption, how big a challenge this is.
Absolutely, because in this particular case, you can just go and check out for yourself, whereas going to the moon just to see for 5 minutes if this works or not, well, we can't do that, obviously.
Yeah, and as we move on in this new era, there's a kind of a new era of space exploration, of space flight, with all the commercial providers that are in place. We'll see the launch cost come down, so the potential for people to send small missions and to test things out and test a destruction will become more viable. But you're right, it's not as easy as just visiting a mine, taking a sample and going to a lab and testing. I mean, it's still there's still a huge amount of uncertainty.
So we have assumptions, but we also are basing the research on certain things we brought back from the moon, or maybe we're simulating, right? Or we send some, I don't know, distant sensors to check certain things. Can you tell us actually what are the things that we brought back or we are creating here on Earth that help us do the research on the moon? Because as we said, you can't go there and just probe.
Yeah, and what we know from the regolith itself, we know from the 350 kilos that came back on the Apollo missions, and we know from remote sensing, and that's what we base our current knowledge base on. So what we can do is we can look at processes for extracting the resources, and then things like excavation and so on, but also the supporting power infrastructure. You talked about making landing pads. There's a lot of people looking at ways of constructing things using things like 3D printing or sintering, making tiles on the moon. So there's lots of people looking at different parts of this puzzle. And you mentioned also startups as a really dynamic community of startups in this field as well. And what we base those developments on is what we call simulants. So it's fake regolith, basically, things that people have made that match the samples that we have from the Apollo missions in some way, and that's how we develop our technologies.
Okay, so for example, if a startup is planning to make some kind of brick-like constructions to create the landing pads, they are using a simulant. They are not using the real regolith, right? These are closed, I don't know, behind some doors somewhere.
They are. NASA really guard their regolith samples very carefully. You need special permission if you want them. I have some contacts who have been given permission to test a destruction, which is very unusual, but they were given, I think, a gram of lunar regolith, and they were, this is a huge amount of sample. I'm from the mining world where we deal in tons. A gram, it's amazing. So, and you're not allowed to tell people where it is. It's under lock and key. There's a huge amount of security that goes on with the real Apollo samples. So it's not practical at the moment. Maybe this will change, but at the moment it's not practical to do all of the developmental work on real regolith samples, so it's done on these simulants.
Okay, and those simulants were created by the people who got access to those samples first, and then they based, or they just had the analysis shared by NASA saying like, okay, these are the chemicals, now go create your simulant.
Pretty much that, yeah. The data's all there, it's all in the public domain, so you can go. Actually, there's a really lovely set of data from the Apollo missions. It's all there, freely available. Gives you all of the sample composition, size distribution, And what people do, and there's a lot of people that do this, they recreate as best they can based on the data that we have.
And also we mentioned another thing that is very much discussed when it comes to space resources is the legal part, right? So a couple of months ago, we had a guest in our show, Dr. Antonino Salmeri, who was talking about space law. And if you haven't listened to this episode, please do, because I think he's a great communicator and it's great to hear that side of things. But I'm mentioning that because Luxembourg is also very special when it comes to space resources and law. Because the problem is, can we take them back? Because as you said, NASA has those samples of lunar regolith, but could they do it legally? How does it work? Can I just go and take a piece of moon for my collection?
Oh, that's the critical question. It's a really hot topic amongst the legal community at the UN level at the moment, is how we can do this, or whether it should be allowed that people go and dig up pieces of the moon and process it to support astronauts, for example, to refuel rockets. And at the moment, it's simply, the situation is that it's not clear at the UN level, but through the US have the Artemis Accords, which state very clearly their position on space resources. And Luxembourg was the second country to have a legal position on the use of space resources. So the Outer Space Treaty says that you can't own a piece of space, but once you've taken a sample of regolith off, for example, then that's different, because you're not setting up a camp on the surface of the moon. Actually, what you've done is take something off the surface of the moon, and this is where it gets rather complex.
So we are starting with that, but the idea is to have camps on the moon too, and we don't have the legal framework for that, do we?
Currently, that is not in place. I wouldn't in any way say that I'm a legal expert, but I think this is very much the discussion at the moment, is how we manage the situation now for the future, so that, you know, we also have a responsibility in this field to avoid the problems that we've made for ourselves on Earth in the way that we have gone about extracting resources on Earth. And again, this is one of the most wonderful topics for this subject, is what can we learn from space resources that we can then apply to Earth.
Yeah, I personally wish that all the things we do on the moon or wherever on the asteroids is going to be really learning from the past, you know, that when we talk about sustainability, it really is sustainability and sustainable use of resources, right? But who knows? I mean, if too many players come into play, we don't really know what the future will hold, but we are obviously positive about it. We don't want to talk about, you know, some dark scenarios here.
Yes, and for us at ESRIC, it's really at the heart of what we will do, this idea that the technologies we develop, the concepts we develop, the research that we do will support the sustainable extraction of resources and the sustainable and responsible use of resources. And this idea of circular economy, recycling, all of these things that we have learnt on Earth, we can apply this directly on the moon.
I have like thousands of questions to you still about the debris and recycling and about the startups. But before we go on, you've mentioned ESRIC again. Can you tell us a little bit more? What is this institution that you're the director of? What do you do?
ESRIC is the European Space Resources Innovation Centre, and it was set up just less than 2 years ago. So we are a department at LIST, at Luxembourg Institute of Science and Technology, and we were formed from a partnership between Luxembourg Space Agency and the European Space Agency. So we're quite unique in terms of how we started. And really the motivation for starting an innovation centre in Luxembourg focused on space resources was brought about because in Europe there's a lot of activity in this field, in the research community and in the startup community. And there is the little pockets of activity, but there's a lack of real kind of focus. And so ESRIC exists to kind of be that focal point in Europe for space resources activity. So we do research and development work, but also we have a program that supports startups. We host and organise events for the community as well, for the space resources community, and we exist to kind of provide that central focus.
Yeah, and if you haven't noticed, there has been for I think 2, 3, 4 years the Space Resources Week. I don't know how many years it's been going on, but that's a really great event to participate in. I participated myself, so I know, I can confirm. And then also another thing that recently happened, I know you were very busy, was the challenge, the rover challenge. Well, what was that about?
Yeah, just to go back to the Space Resources Week, that's the largest gathering of space resources people in the world. So, and it's held here in Luxembourg, just down the road, actually, the box. So next year it'll be the week of April the 17th. But the challenge, the ESRIC challenge that happened earlier on in September, was this idea of using a challenge to really push innovation. So we had 5 teams who were competing to map a section of the moon. But obviously they weren't on the moon, they were in Rockhal, which...
Almost the same.
It's pretty much the same. No, well, it was actually. We covered Rockhal in hundreds of tons of basalt, put a lunar lander in there, some craters, mixed in a resource, and then they had to map the area of the moon and use their rover technology to do so. So it was all done remotely. They even included the delay that you would have in communications with your rover that you'd have on the moon.
And we're talking about 3 seconds, right, with the moon, more or
yeah,
less?
3-4 seconds, yeah.
That's a delay. That's why also another discussion, of course, okay, the moon, fair enough, but if we go further, the delay is a big issue, isn't it?
Yeah, automation becomes much more challenging when we have huge communication delays.
Yeah.
But the ESRIC challenge was, I think it was a really interesting, exciting experience for the teams that took part. It was a good learning experience, I think, for everyone. And the objective there was a coordinated event between ESRIC, ESA and LSA and LIST, but the teams were competing to win, if you like, a contract with ESA to develop their technology further. So the point is, it's not just a competition to win a trophy. Actually, the prize is the opportunity to develop that further, and so maybe one day we'll see it on the moon.
Do we talk about basing their activity in Luxembourg and cooperating with ESA? Because I know that the startup program that you have, the idea is that the startups will have their activity here in Luxembourg. But for the challenge, it doesn't matter where they are. It's just in Europe or not? How? Or not even, right? US, I think there were also some American companies.
There was a Canadian team. So
okay.
For a contract with ESA, then they need to be ESA member states.
Okay.
So of which Canada is. So that was the constraint there. But for the startup support program, which you mentioned, that there's no restriction on where people apply from in the world. So the startup support program, again, it's in collaboration with ESA. And here we invite startups to put forward their idea for a space resources related business. And 5 of those then get put forward into a 12-week pre-incubation phase. And then one of those 5 then gets put forward into a full 2-year incubation here in Luxembourg. So the first phase, they can be based anywhere around the world. In that we had companies from the US in addition to Europe. But for phase 2, if they get selected, they're registered in Luxembourg.
In the space campus that is coming, I assume.
Yes, well, they'll be hosted in Technoport, but then that's obviously down in Belval where the space campus will be.
Yeah, of course. I'm mentioning it, assuming that everybody knows about it. But, I've been sharing like crazy. I don't know how many times on the social media saying like, look, what's happening. But yeah, I guess we have to tell for the people who don't know. So what's going to happen? Space campus in Belval. What is that? That's a plan, a cooperation with. How is it going to work?
Yeah, this is an initiative at the government level. They are creating 2 space campuses, actually, one down in Belval, where we are at LIST, and the other one in Cockleshire. So all the science and research that's done relating to space currently will be hosted on a single campus down in Belval.
And ESRIC will be there?
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
we will move across from our current location, across the road to the other side.
Well, at least not a lot of work and pretty sustainable for moving, Good planning then. But yes, yet another reason to visit Belval. I mean, it's amazing how fast it is developing. Every single time I go, I'm like, another building with loads of researchers.
Yeah, I absolutely love the Belval site so much. Those blast furnaces, I can stare at them all day. And I every time I walk past them, what I love is the scale. This is one of the reasons I got into engineering, was the scale of those blast furnaces. I absolutely love them. But also you look at the complexity of them, and sometimes you kind of stare, you've got all the access points, the piping, the instrumentation, and then you think, actually, we're going to do this on a smaller scale, but this level of detail on the moon, it's amazing. Like, genuinely, like I love them.
I agree. I'm actually from a mining region in Poland, so it kind of makes me feel at home in a way, which I know is a bit strange, right? But still, yes, I also stare at them. So I'm happy we're the two of us staring. Well, yeah. In case you see someone staring, it's either Kathryn or me.
Yeah, just gazing upwards at them, thinking about things. Yeah, previously I lived in Cornwall, and there it was once the richest area in the world because of all the copper and tin mining through the 19th century. So I've gone from somewhere that was once at the forefront of the world in terms of deep mining copper and tin. Now I stare at blast furnaces. Great.
While
thinking about the future. I know.
Exactly. Coming back, because you mentioned the other minerals, and I just wanted to discuss that as well. We are, again, basing ourselves on the moon, and we talked about oxygen and water and whatever. But there is also another idea. We are talking about the so-called rare earth minerals, right? And we are trying to get some maybe at a certain moment from the moon and bring them back. Is there something like that cooking, or not really?
For us at ESRIC, it's not at all what we are looking at. It's an interesting concept, the rare earths. I think because rare earths are used so widely in renewable energy technologies, and because they're called rare earths, I think there's an idea that they are actually very hard to find. That's not necessarily the case. Rare earths actually, there's not, there's plenty of them around, really.
So they were misnamed.
They are. They're kind of, not that rare earths. The challenge with rare earths is actually in the extraction and processing. So this is really going into my field of processing. But the problem is the mineralogy, and they are so complex to extract in an economically viable way that is really what presents the large challenge. So we always talk about rare earths because China produces, I think, 97%. There's been other rare earth mines around the world, but they've struggled to stay open because it's just such a difficult processing challenge. And I don't think we know enough yet about the rare earths on the moon to say whether it would be significantly easier to do than it is on Earth, and whether that would be more economically viable than what we have on Earth.
Somehow my assumption is that it won't. I mean, looking at all the processes, that they are definitely significantly more difficult. I wouldn't say, but who knows? Maybe there is something we're still not looking at. I mean, this is just the beginning of everything, I would say, right?
Yeah, all we can say is what we have, the information we have today, based on the data we have, what we know will happen in the next 5 to 10 years in terms of kind of demonstration missions for producing water and oxygen and those characterization and kind of ramp up into some kind of pilot scale production. But beyond that, I don't think we can be so sure.
Another thing I just thought about is, in case you're interested in space resources and also Star Trek, actually, I'll be in November at the Researchers' Days talking to Dr. Jan Thummel about true science in Star Trek and space resource activity of Luxembourg. We kind of are planning to make it work. We'll see how it goes. But yeah, it's just, I don't know if you know about the event here in Luxembourg, Researchers' Days. It's an FNR event. There'll be a science cafe where we'll talk about that. So yes, to our listeners, please come. I will be definitely still telling you about, now I don't remember the exact date. I'm very sorry, but I'll definitely share the information later on. So just another thing I wanted to mention. But coming back to the moon, just to summarize my understanding. So we're really not talking about bringing something back. We're focusing on reusing what is there and then maybe going to deep space.
Yes, that's exactly where we are at the moment, is talking about extracting what we can, using it in situ, and using that to allow us to do more science, which I think is always a positive thing for us, and also to travel further into space.
Okay, so that's the moon. And we only, for the last 20 minutes, mainly focused on space resources on the moon. But that's not the end. We're also talking about asteroids, aren't we? What do we know about asteroids? What are we planning to get from them, except for deflecting as recently, right?
Yes.
It was also like a couple of days ago.
No, it was through the night, actually. That reminds me, I forgot to check up on it this morning. They were, the DART mission. I completely forgot. I must check that later. Asteroids are an interesting puzzle. I think a lot of people see them as a way of extracting metals that we can use on Earth. So then we really start talking about bringing things back to Earth, which means that then we can move some of our heavy industry off the Earth and
pollute somewhere else.
Exactly. Let's not worry about deep space. That's okay. But actually, even again, we need to unlock this potential first on the moon before we can really think about asteroids. We can do some good scientific exploration with understanding better the composition of metals on asteroids, how we might extract. But again, this is more into the future than it is the lunar resources. And actually, we haven't talked about Mars either, because there was the really lovely experiment of Mars that worked on Perseverance, the MOXIE experiment, where they produced oxygen from the lunar atmosphere. And that really is that's the first demonstration of the production of a resource in situ. So that was, it's small, but worked absolutely to plan, the MOXIE experiment. And so people are looking to Mars because there's plenty more resources that we can use. And because of the distance from the Earth, obviously, we need to make sure that we can support humans.
As usual, there'll be some show notes where I'll share exactly. You can read up more about MOXIE experiment, because now I would talk another 20 minutes about it. And I just want to more touch upon Mars, as you mentioned. So would you say that when it comes to space resources, after the moon, the next challenge is Mars or rather asteroids? Or are we doing it parallelly? Or is it science fiction so far?
We are doing it. I mean, there's an element of science fiction about this, but that's why we love it. We're doing it parallel. There's people who are focusing on asteroids, and then there's the people who are focusing on Mars. But Mars is a more tangible goal, if you like, because we have rovers there, because we have the experiments that show that you can produce oxygen in situ. And one of the next designs is basically a bigger version of MOXIE that can produce oxygen. So I think Mars is a more realistic prospect, if you like, than the bringing material from asteroids back to Earth. But that doesn't mean to say that people aren't exploring asteroids. There are still people who are very interested in that.
And when it comes to delay and Mars, what kind of differences are we talking about?
11 minutes, I think.
Oh my!
Oh, somewhere around there. It's 7 to 11 minutes.
That's a lot. So it has to be fully automized. Basically.
Yes, absolutely.
There's no way to.
And this is one of the great things about this whole subject, is that when we have mines and any kind of process on Earth, things always break. And so when I've worked on plants before, there's always things breaking, and there's always someone there to hit it with a hammer, fix it in some way, tie it back together. There's always somebody there to fix things. And we don't have this opportunity on the moon or on Mars. So we need to be sure that our systems, especially if they're supporting human life, are reliable. And that will be one of the big challenges in the near term, is how we can make sure not only do we have remote operation, do we have an automatic system, but also that it's reliable or that it can be fixed. And that's one of my favourite topics, is about how we go about maintaining and keeping things reliable.
And very challenging, as you said. So that's the technological challenge. Any other we could mention here? When it comes to what we have to really overcome, any obstacles so far?
There's so many, it's all obstacles.
Oh no!
Because again, if you think about all the processes that we have on Earth, I mean, we make use of the Earth's gravity. Obviously, we have no choice. So Earth's gravity helps us in moving things around, moving materials from one place to another.
We haven't mentioned that at all, right?
Yeah.
But this is like really, when you watch science fiction movies, I always laugh. They always just walk like this, no problem, in spaceships or whatever, right? I mean, there's completely different atmosphere that we need to deal with.
Yeah. There's no fluids at all, no process fluids. So we can't make use of water, and we have no air. So there's huge temperature swings. On the moon, the lunar day is 2 weeks and the lunar night is 2 weeks. So you've got huge temperature plunges in the lunar night. And then the dust itself, the lunar dust, is really, really abrasive because there's no atmosphere, there's no weathering. So we've got this very abrasive, fine material that is just set to try and kill you. So all of those things taken into account, then it looks like we have a lot to do.
Oh, yes.
We'll be busy at ESRIC.
Definitely. So I don't think you will be able to stare at the furnaces because you'll be going to be very busy closed up there in the space campus. Okay. I wanted to understand as well, because I said technological challenges. What about the economic ones? I mean, we're talking about a lot of money we need to invest, right? Oh, that's not the problem.
It is one of the interesting conversations that is often had. There's a lot of people interested in how they can support this. And obviously there's a lot of startups that have ideas, but there's no near-term revenue stream, if you like, unless you have a terrestrial application of whatever your business happens to be. And this will be in parallel to the technological challenges and the legal questions. The economic questions are really significant. Is how do we finance something that is so uncertain? And how do we support something with such long time frames? I mean, if we're talking 5-10 years, then how can we support those businesses with those ideas to survive until this becomes a reality?
So another kind of supporting research where you have really long time frame, right? I mean, we have other fields where it also happens. You just don't know when you will be able to use certain applications. So it's the same here. But of course, ESRIC is going to come into play and help a lot with all the startups that you're already supporting and you will support, right? Because there's going to be another call, or is it already
finished? It just closed at the weekend. So
okay, so sorry if you were planning to
It's
apply.
all right. There's another one next year. So we run this twice a year. The first call was open in spring. So the first round of 5 startups were pre-incubated earlier in summer. And from those, one of those will have been selected, and that will be announced at New Space Europe, which is 27th, 28th of October. But in parallel, we've had a second call, and that just closed. So we will be looking through the applications and selecting the 5 that will be pre-incubated. And then, like I say, we run the whole thing again next year. So if you have an idea, it is not too late.
It's never too late. There'll be another call for sure for you.
Yeah,
Yes.
these are long time frames. There's a lot. I've set the scene now. There's loads of gaps. There's a lot to do, lots to think about. So hopefully that should inspire some of you.
Yeah, I don't know how many of our listeners are actually into space and startups, but who knows? I mean, the appeal was there, so the call for action, who knows? But if you manage actually through this listening today that you apply and then you get to be incubated, please let me know, because I would love to be at the start of the idea, let's say, as such. But also, talking of stars, we also need to start slowly talking about finishing and ends of the podcast, unfortunately. So before we wrap up and I ask you a few more questions, we have to go back to the pub quiz question that you asked in the beginning. I hope you remember.
Yes.
So can you please repeat the question and then tell us what the answer is?
So the question was, if we're supporting 2 astronauts for a year on the surface of the moon, how much of the lunar soil do we need to dig up to produce the oxygen to support them? And the answer is we need around about 4.5 meters square, and we're going to dig about 5 centimeter depth. So the way we get to that answer, it doesn't sound that much really. I mean, 2 astronauts for a whole year, that will provide enough oxygen for them to survive. So, 4.5 meter square, 5 centimeters depth. So just scooping gently from the surface. Lots of assumptions here, obviously, that a human needs, how much oxygen a human needs over the year, but also that the regolith itself is 40% by weight oxygen, and that we extract all of that from the regolith. And so obviously that's a significant assumption there. So the calculation was you need about 1.5 tons of regolith to produce about 600 kilos of oxygen.
Okay, and which regolith stimulant were you using for this research?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, they all are about 40% by weight oxygen, so I'm not going to specify the stimulant.
Okay,
but that's actually a very pertinent question.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, another question I would ask. Sorry, as usual, I always come with loads of questions. Is how do we know how much oxygen we actually need? I mean, let's say astronaut not moving too much. Would it require, limiting yourself to certain activities? I mean, the astronaut there would be also working and moving and whatever. So it's also this kind of a median of the oxygen you need to support yourself, right?
Yes, this is based on the ISS. So data that NASA have from the ISS on their assumptions of how much an astronaut needs.
Okay, so they've been measuring and they know.
Yeah, we trust NASA with those numbers.
I will not say anything more about that, but I wanted just to come back to the startup program once again, because we were mentioning that. I don't want to necessarily delve into all the startups and what they're doing, but the last 5 incubees, can we say that? I don't know if that's English. The incubated, let's put it this way, were exactly like what you said. One of them is trying to construct certain bricks to construct the launching pads, right? The other one is more about recycling. And that I wanted to actually focus on a little bit because we did not talk about it. Space resources and using the debris. So kind of recycling, getting some material out of it. Is that also part of the space resources activity or not really?
It is. And what's been really interesting over the last couple of years is that when we started talking about space resources, it was all very much about ISRU. But the narrative has shifted, and it's certainly something that I've been pushing for a few years, this idea of sustainability. And it was the FNR Pearl funding that I got to start a research group as part of ESRIC was focused very much on this idea of circular economy and sustainability and responsibility. And so recycling is a key part of this. I said earlier on that in space, everything's a resource. And that includes all of the things that we brought with us that we no longer need. And that expands to include space debris. So what we find over the last couple of years actually is this idea of space debris as a resource has really become a much stronger part of the story. And how we go about recycling that, where we do it, how we do it, how we then can reuse those materials. I think we'll hear a lot more about that in the next few years, and it's certainly something I'm keen to do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's yet another idea because first you have to catch it somehow, then you have to figure out where you recycle it, right? That the idea would be on the moon, I guess, not bringing it back to Earth. Or there are so many ideas again.
Do you do it in orbit? Do you do it on the moon? Where do you do it? I think that's that we don't know the answer yet. And then actually the recycling process itself, it always comes back to mineral processing. If I'm near, there's a mineral processing side of it, how we separate, how we shred, how we then reuse. So there's a lot of really fun topics there, and like I say, that forms some of the work that we do at ESRIC.
Okay, and then also like just to mention the other startups, let's say there was also some kind of swarm of rovers, right, for moon mining and 3D printing, as you mentioned as well, right? I would love to have a researcher to talk about 3D printing because I want to understand it more. So definitely, please watch out for the next, I don't know, maybe in the next 5-6 episodes, there'll be someone talking about that too. But this also means that today I think we have to say goodbye to Kathryn and thank her very much for all her knowledge. I would love to talk about mining like on Earth too, but today we focused more on space resources and space. I know Kathryn is passionate about both, so in case you see her one day, you can ask a lot of questions. She'll be happy to share. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
This is the end of the podcast today. I hope you enjoyed the show. Please don't forget to subscribe, to follow us on all the usual social media channels. And yeah, until next.
My name is Hanna Siemaszko, and this was SciLax, powered by Research Luxembourg.